Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're undertaking a pretty intense exploration of history's pressure points. You know, those moments when civilizations that seem, well, unstoppable suddenly just fracture.
Hmm.
We often like the story of history as this sort of upward march of progress, right? Inevitable. But our sources today really argue that civilization is inherently fragile. It's this incredibly complex balancing act.
And it can be lost so quickly when those internal structures start to fail.
Yeah,
That fragility is exactly what we need to dig into. When we look at the great empires, it's easy to romanticize the long stretches of stability, the big achievements.
sure.
But when you really scrutinize the evidence of collapse, maybe it's a sudden military defeat of a huge city, or maybe a whole economy just failing the weaknesses, well, they're almost always structural.
Structural how?
Like long-term political decay or maybe military rot, just sitting there waiting for that one single focused external shock to deliver the final blow.
Right. So today we've gathered material that really covers these pivotal moments of, let's call it societal failure and radical transformation. We're spanning continents, centuries, looking at the political mess leading up to Constantinople's fall,
Uh-huh.
the sophisticated collapse of the Aztec Empire, the internal problems that doomed the Roman Republic, and even how modern, like 20th century ideologies weaponize conflict. It's quite a range.
It is. And our mission today really is to get beyond just the dates and the famous names. We want to try and identify those recurring structural flaws, political paralysis, military inflexibility, sometimes just sticking too rigidly to tradition.
Things that undermine human achievement, even when that achievement looks totally solid.
Exactly. So we're asking, what does the historical record tell you about that precise moment when internal unity just dissolves right when the external pressure is cranking up?
Okay, let's kick off with a classic case study of institutional failure, one that really defined the end of the Middle Ages. The fall of Constantinople in 1453. Here you've got a society, the Byzantine Empire, just riddled with internal divisions, political, religious, actively weakening itself just as this, well, massively efficient external military machine shows up at the gates.
The Byzantine state was exhausted. I mean, truly exhausted, militarily and politically. By the 1450s, what was left of the empire was leaning really heavily on Western support.
Right.
Emperor Constantine, he was sending these increasingly desperate pleas westward. Send troops, send ships, hoping he could leverage the threat of Islam to kind of unite Christians under his banner.
And those pleas were aimed squarely at the Pope in Rome, Nicholas V. But the response he got back was, well, notoriously cold. Conditional, even.
Yeah.
Why was the head of Western Christendom seemingly so resistant, even when the Turkish threat was obviously right there looming?
Because the Byzantines were fatally divided amongst themselves. Our sources show Constantine made this really unwise move. He included statements from the powerful anti-unionist faction in his messages.
The anti-unionists. These were the Greeks who really hated the idea of merging the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches.
Vehemently opposed it, yes.
Yeah.
And they were proposing a new synod to renegotiate the terms of union. Right at this moment of ultimate crisis, it was just political malpractice.
Wow. So that seemingly small detail, just including that in the message.
It created immense political toxicity. Nicholas V was getting his own detailed briefings, from agents like Gregory about all the political turmoil and confusion this supposed union agreement was causing back in Constantinople.
Okay.
The Pope was already pretty frustrated with Byzantine resistance to his authority anyway. So when he saw the anti-unionists were still playing political games, basically, his resolve just hardened.
So he dug in his heels.
He did. He responded bluntly. Essentially gave Constantine an ultimatum. Affirm the full decree of union, no conditions, or, find the papacy unwilling to help his empire.
And that threat, which was meant to force unity.
It backfired spectacularly. It actually stiffened the resolve of the anti-unionists inside Constantinople. It just ensured the Byzantines stayed politically fractured right up until the final assault. Just incredible internal division.
But the paralysis wasn't only religious, was it? Our material shows some pretty profound political betrayal, too. Like in August 1452, months before the siege even started, a minority of senators actually voted to just abandon the city. Give it up. Seriously. Abandon Constantinople. The complete collapse of collective political will.
Wow. And this internal rigidity, this paralysis, it contrasts so sharply with the agility of the attacker, Sultan Mehmed II and his Ottoman forces.
The sources really paint a stark picture there. The Byzantines described as hidebound by 1,000 years of ceremony and tradition, inflexible, militarily, politically.
Yeah, stuck in their ways.
While the Ottomans, meanwhile, were seen as quick-witted, flexible, and open, constantly adapting their strategy, paying attention to what was actually happening on the ground.
And their ruling style, that gave them an immediate edge in consolidating conquests, too. For many Balkan peasants, Ottoman rule, well, it was often actually preferable to the grinding yoke of European feudalism.
Really? How so?
Well, when the Ottomans conquered a region, they generally didn't force immediate conversion on Christians. It sounds paradoxical, but the dynasty kind of preferred Christians to remain Christians.
Yeah.
Initially, anyway.
Why is that?
Because under Sharia law, it was harder to tax Muslims as heavily as non-Muslims. So the tax burden on many Christians under Ottoman rule was often actually lighter than what their old feudal lords imposed. That helped dampen resistance.
Interesting. So a lighter touch in some ways, but the military shock, that was something else entirely. We often focus on the sheer size of those Ottoman cannons.
Huge cannons, yeah. Urban's cannon.
But what really seems to have demoralized the defenders, according to the sources, was the speed. The sheer speed with which those concentrated heavy weapons just demolished the ancient, supposedly redoubtable walls.
Think about the defenses near the St. Romanus Gate in the Lycus Valley. That was always the weak spot, and the Ottomans just hammered it. Focused their firepower there with devastating efficiency. The bombardment was relentless.
And then the tower collapsed.
Right, when the mighty Bactitinian tower collapsed. That was a massive psychological blow. Imagine seeing centuries of stone defense just turn to dust in a matter of days. The defenders felt utterly exposed. Niccolò Barbaro wrote, that panic just set in immediately. Everyone thought they'd see Turkish turbans inside the city any second.
They calculated, didn't they, that a concerted attack by just 10,000 troops at that specific breach point would be unstoppable.
Yeah, certain loss, and yet this imminent existential disaster was only compounded by the institutionalized self-interest of their supposed Christian allies.
Ah, the allies. The failure of outside powers to coordinate is just a perfect microcosm of late medieval politics, isn't it?
It really is. Look at Genoa and Venice, two major maritime republics, huge vested interests in the region. On April 13th, Genoa was formally inviting its citizens to go help the emperor.
Okay.
But just 5 days earlier, the Republic had authorized loans specifically to arm ships against the Venetians.
You're kidding.
Nope. Their economic rivalry was clearly a much higher priority than, the survival of Constantinople.
Unbelievable. And the papacy's response is almost just as bad. Pope Nicholas V apparently wanted to loan Constantine 5 galleys. That would have been significant help.
It would have. But the Venetians, focused entirely on their financial ledger books, basically reminded the papacy that the cost of galleys for the failed Varna Crusade.
Which was like 9 years earlier, 1444?
Exactly. That bill was still outstanding.
So an old debt from a failed campaign nearly a decade before trumped the immediate existential crisis of saving the capital of Eastern Christendom.
Pretty much. The institution of finance literally immobilized the institution of faith. It's stark.
And that final desperate moment of collapse, it just shows the razor's edge history turns on. The Christian flotilla trying to escape, delayed because the Venetian captains were trying to pick up survivors.
While the Genoese podesta, Lomellino, was barring the city gates, desperate to stop a mass exodus that would leave the city totally defenseless. Chaos.
Chaos. And they only got out of the Golden Horn after hacking away at the boom.
Right, 2 men hacking at the massive wooden boom holding the chain across the harbor entrance. And even then, their final escape out into the open sea. That required incredible luck. Pure meteorological luck.
The wind changed.
Yeah, a sudden, powerful 12-knot wind kicked up from the north, propelling them out of the Bosphorus to safety. Without that sheer stroke of environmental fortune, many more would have been captured. The loss of life would have been even worse.
So the fall of Constantinople, it wasn't just a military failure. It was the result of a political system that was rigid, internally divided, economically paralyzed by old debts, and relying on allies who cared more about their own bottom line.
A perfect storm of internal decay meeting external force. Okay, so if Constantinople shows us decay and external military shock, the conquest of the Aztec Empire by the Spanish, That gives us a look at what happens when a really highly sophisticated, highly ritualized civilization runs headfirst into a ruthless foreign power, one that's just willing to toss out all the existing rules of war and diplomacy.
Yeah, and this section is so important for challenging that old, frankly, racist narrative of indigenous peoples as just empty vessels, right? When the Spanish Franciscans showed up, they absolutely expected to find, quote, childlike natives just waiting for Christian instruction.
What they found was very different.
Instead, they found themselves locked in these intense debates with skilled rhetoricians who were immensely proud of their own intellectual traditions.
The Mexica priests, they engaged in really sophisticated intellectual fencing. They didn't just reject the new faith out of hand, they actually tried to establish a kind of rhetorical parody.
How did they do that?
They identified themselves to the friars as mothers to the people, fathers to the people, basically asserting, look, we are also high-ranking clerics. We provide the essential moral structure, the spiritual comfort for our society.
So an appeal to shared status.
Exactly. Their argument was essentially that abruptly disavowing their ancestral faith, the faith of their parents and grandparents, would lead to total societal collapse, spiritual emptiness. It would be irresponsible.
That's a powerful argument. Trying to find common ground, between two elite intellectual classes, trying to turn it from a fight about raw power into a discussion about theology and philosophy.
A very sophisticated move.
Oh.
But the Franciscans ultimately chose to reject that parody. They fell back on the crude, undeniable argument that comes from raw conquest.
Yeah.
The ultimate evidence the friars presented for conversion was brutally simple. The Mexicans' own gods were not powerful enough to liberate them from the hands of the Spaniards.
Oof. That's just the brutal reality of power overriding everything else, isn't it? Doesn't matter how deep your intellectual tradition or cultural sophistication is. Military defeat gives the conquerors the ultimate tangible proof of their own divine mandate.
And it forced the Mexican leaders to publicly renounce their old religion in this very public, very sober ceremony. A complete humiliation, basically driven by military fact.
But it's crucial to remember, the Aztec Empire itself wasn't some fleeting thing. It was built on immense historical depth and a very calculated use of power.
Absolutely. They weren't just some flash-in-the-pan dynasty. Our sources really emphasize how consciously they connected themselves to deep historical legitimacy. They wanted to legitimize their rule by claiming descent from older, venerated civilizations.
Like the Toltecs.
The Toltec Tula, yeah, which flourished around 900 to 1100 CE, and even more importantly, Teotihuacan. They revered Teotihuacan as the city of the gods, the absolute wellspring of political authority and mythic legitimacy.
And there's actual physical evidence of this reverence, right? That Olmec mask.
That's an incredible find, yeah. Archaeologists discovered a mint-condition Olmec mask dated all the way back to 1000 BCE.
Oh.
Carefully placed inside a burial cache at the great Aztec temple in Tenochtitlan. That's a span of 2,500 years. It shows this profound, deliberate connection to the deep Mesoamerican past. This wasn't just a fleeting imperial moment. They saw themselves as inheritors.
And this immense commitment to the imperial system, this history, it extended right to their ruler, Moctezuma Xochitlán. He governed from 1502 to 1520. He was both a successful military commander and an expert ritual leader.
Right. Moctezuma commanded enormous resources. His lifestyle was famously extravagant, including apparently over 200 wives.
200?
Yeah, but that wasn't just personal indulgence. Those marriages represented crucial political arrangements. They secured necessary military and economic alliances across their vast empire. He was the linchpin holding the whole thing together.
Yet when the Spanish arrived, this existential threat, the sources suggest he became hesitant, vulnerable.
Yeah. Vulnerable, pensive, and hesitant is how he's described. Perhaps because this threat, the Spanish, just didn't fit into his established framework. His whole worldview was built around a certain kind of ritualized state conflict.
That idea of ritualized conflict seems key. How did the Aztecs actually view warfare? And why might that mindset have made them rigid when facing such an unknown enemy?
Warfare for them was intensely ritualized.
Yeah.
It was deeply woven into the state's spiritual requirements. I mean, the human hearts taken in sacrifice after battle were poetically likened to fine burnished turquoise, the most valuable substance they knew.
Wow.
War itself had a specific name, Tiahuatlacanoli. It literally translates to something like divine liquid and burnt things.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests war was seen as a necessary sacred state activity, like feeding the gods.
And dying in battle was the highest honor.
The ultimate sacrifice,
Yeah.
yes. It's called Moquinquetli, which means flowery death,
Huh.
comparing battlefield death to something beautiful, noble, almost aesthetic.
'Cause that requires a huge state commitment, doesn't it, to maintain that ideology?
Tremendous commitment. Wealth, energy, sustaining this continuous cycle of festivals, sacrifices, and military expeditions just to placate what the sources call a crowded and hungry pantheon of divine entities. The entire system was perfectly designed for the challenges it knew.
But not for this new one.
Exactly. It lacked the conceptual flexibility to deal with an enemy like the Spanish, who weren't fighting for captives for sacrifice or for ritual submission. They fought for outright materialistic destruction and total subjugation, a completely different ballgame.
Okay, so the Aztec case shows us maybe cultural rigidity shattering under this unprecedented pressure. But if we look again at long-lived empires like Rome and Byzantium, the historical record seems to suggest that internal decay often sets the stage for external vulnerability, sometimes centuries before the final collapse actually happens.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Let's swing back to Byzantium for a second, but focus specifically on how their domestic military structure basically disintegrated.
Right. The decline of the regular enlisted Byzantine army, those famous thematic armies, it's a classic example of imperial self-sabotage, driven largely by short-sighted financial decisions.
The thematic system that was based on peasant soldiers, wasn't it?
Exactly. Peasant soldiers who held small inherited plots of land. This system provided both food security for the region and a standing domestic military force, usually led by a military governor, the strategos. It was deeply integrated into the social and agricultural fabric.
So what went wrong? What destroyed this seemingly stable system?
Our sources point pretty directly to the destruction of those peasant soldier land holdings. That, coupled with some disastrous anti-military policies brought in under Emperor Constantine the Ninth around the mid-11th century.
Constantine the Ninth again. He seems to pop up a lot in these moments of decline.
He does. He neglected to fund the army properly, and critically, he was always looking for immediate cash, ready income. So he allowed soldiers to actually buy off their obligation to serve.
Wait, the state essentially sold the right to not do military service?
Pretty much. Converting a fundamental duty into a revenue stream.
What was the consequence of that? Seems incredibly short-sighted.
The consequence was catastrophic for the state's integrity. It created this massive, immediate hole in local defense capabilities. Civilian provincial governors started replacing the military strategos.
Yeah.
And those domestic, loyal, standing armies just dissolved.
Leaving a vacuum.
A huge vacuum, which was increasingly filled by relying on foreign mercenaries.
Right, we mentioned them earlier. The Varangians from Russia, Normans from Italy and France, even Anglo-Saxons from England.
Relying on groups like these fundamentally changed the nature of imperial power. Yes, they were often effective fighting units. The Varangian Guard, the Dugina, was famous.
Yeah.
But they were incredibly expensive. Their loyalty was only to the paymaster, whoever that happened to be, and they were inherently destabilizing. Well, when you lose the capacity to defend yourself locally, with a loyal domestic force tied to the land, the empire becomes completely vulnerable to the whims and pressures of outsiders. Mercenaries can switch sides, they can demand more pay, they can interfere in politics. It's an irreversible shift. You go from self-sufficiency to dependency.
Okay, so Byzantine decay involved the failure of this military and social structure. If we look at the Roman Republic, its fragility seems centered more on deep political tensions. That internal class struggle often seems more potent, more fracturing than any external threat they faced early on.
Absolutely. The fracturing of the Roman Republic really centered on this chasm between the practical, everyday needs of the common people and the high-minded, often self-serving rhetoric of the senatorial elite.
The sources suggest ordinary Romans were often pretty pragmatic, weren't they? They preferred someone like Julius Caesar with his concrete reforms, cash handouts, support for the poor, overseas settlements for veterans.
Because it addressed their real-world needs, yeah.
Compared to the fine-sounding ideas of liberty that the elite were always talking about, those ideas were often viewed with considerable suspicion by the populace.
And probably rightly so in many cases. Our material suggests that for many ordinary Romans, the elite's obsession with liberty often looked like just an alibi for elite self-interest.
Meaning
it was a way to maintain their own oligarchical control, their grip on power and wealth, and to stop strong, reforming figures like Caesar from actually redistributing any of that power or wealth downwards. This fundamental class-based cynicism just severely weakened political cohesion.
And then once the empire replaced the republic, that internal contradiction didn't just vanish, did it? It just sort of shifted onto the emperor himself, created an almost impossible governing burden.
That's a great way to put it. The emperor was constantly forced to manage the simultaneous and often totally contradictory demands of two incredibly powerful groups.
Which were?
On one side, you had the general populace. They usually wanted peace, stability, emperors who weren't too ambitious, princes who wouldn't drag them into costly, pointless wars.
Okay, makes sense. And the other side?
The soldiers, especially the legions, the very engine of imperial authority, the guys who could make or break a new emperor.
And the soldiers, particularly those powerful legions, they loved the warlike, cruel, and rapacious prince, according to the sources. Why?
Because those qualities promised them immediate, tangible rewards, double pay, opportunities for plunder, the chance to vent their own greed and cruelty, often on the civilian populace.
Right.
So it meant that almost any new emperor coming to power often had to appease the powerful military first, butter them up, which inherently risked alienating the civilian population, fueling discontent, resentment, maybe even civil unrest down the line.
As Machiavelli pointed out later, the whole system was structurally prone to rupture because the goals of its two main support groups were basically mutually exclusive. You couldn't please both.
Exactly, a built-in fragility.
Okay, so this reliance on mercenary power, this fragmented political loyalty we see in the late empire and the successor states, it seems to lead us to a really fascinating shift in how power itself was expressed and maybe legitimized. If the state couldn't always rely on a loyal domestic army to enforce its will, maybe it started relying more on the symbolic authority of objects. Let's look at how power and politics were expressed not just through laws and decrees, but through the actual things themselves.
Yeah, we're shifting here from looking at centralized political decay to thinking about decentralized symbolic power, what some historians call the agency of objects. It's really interesting in the early medieval period, Anglo-Saxon and Viking context especially.
Agency of objects, meaning the objects had a will of their own.
Almost, yeah. In their literature, swords and weapons weren't just tools for violence. They were often portrayed as actors in their own right, having personalities, qualities, maybe even intentions, independent of the person wielding them.
That must create a strange dynamic. If your sword has its own personality, the owner needs to somehow assert control, right?
That might be why we see practices like inscribing weapons with runes, inscriptions often only visible to the user. It could have been a kind of ritual attempt to establish control over, or maybe communication with, these potentially powerful, maybe even disobedient possessions. The object itself was almost like another political actor in the scene.
And the most potent example of this object agency must be holy relics. We're talking about bits of bone, fragments of clothing from saints, things that held immense spiritual and political authority.
Absolutely. These fragments weren't just reminders of the saint. They were believed to retain the saint's personality entirely. And what's really critical for our discussion on fragility is that these relics were known or believed to actively resist or encourage movement based on God's will.
So they could refuse to be moved.
Yeah. Imagine a lord tries to move a powerful saint's relic to his newly built castle to legitimize it, give it spiritual clout. If the relic refused to budge, if the cart got stuck, if strange things happened, that would cause an immediate crisis of legitimacy. It would be seen as clear divine disapproval. The relic's power was independent of the human owner trying to manipulate it.
Wow. Even small personal items could carry this kind of weight, couldn't they? Amulets, old heirloom coins, even things like fossilized shark teeth.
They developed their own itinerary, as one source puts it. They functioned as sort of miniature versions of their initial power source. Long after they might have fragmented or stopped being used for their original purpose, they carried status, history, protection, all embedded in the material itself. It was a highly portable form of political and spiritual capital.
And this idea of portable, visible status brings us neatly to the concept of the display economy, which is perfectly illustrated by that amazing find, the Han Hoard, a 9th century Viking period treasure cache discovered in Norway.
A tumen. Yeah, an incredible find. It contained about 200 objects. Coins, intricate rings, beads, pendants, sourced from all across the known world at the time. From Rome, Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, an astonishing collection reflecting global trade and political reach.
But this hoard, all this wealth, it wasn't really intended for everyday economic circulation like spending the coins, was it?
No, probably not. And this is the crucial part of understanding the display economy. Wealth, in this context, is only really power if it's physically demonstrated, if it's visible.
So you had to show it off.
Exactly. The items in the hoard were clearly repurposed as ornaments. They were converted into high-status artifacts meant to be worn and seen. Coins weren't used as currency. They were skillfully mounted into elaborate pendants or incorporated into jewelry.
Why was the point?
The very act of accumulating these exotic items from distant powerful lands, then commissioning skilled artisans to transform them into unique ornaments, and then displaying them, wearing them, gifting them, that's what reinforced elite status. It demonstrated connections, wealth, power, taste. It cemented gift exchange networks and political ties. The hoard itself, buried perhaps for safekeeping or as an offering, represented the political and economic reach of whoever accumulated and deposited it.
So the fragility here is kind of obvious. This kind of power, based on visibility, on ritual, on possessing specific objects, is immediately vulnerable. If the relic decides to move somewhere else, or if your treasure hoard is lost, stolen, or fragmented, the political legitimacy it confers can be instantly withdrawn or diminished.
Precisely. Which leads to one last interesting point about objects and power in this period: legal authority. Even in medieval law, written texts, like charters or legal documents, were often treated almost like physical objects themselves, rather than just abstract records.
How do you mean?
Sometimes, a physical object accompanying the text, maybe a symbolic piece of turf from the land being transferred, or a specially broken knife, signifying an agreement that object carried greater power as proof of the event than the written words or signatures alone. The material object, the tangible thing, was often seen as the ultimate source of legal and political authority, not just the abstract concept recorded on parchment.
Okay, so as that kind of centralized political authority was collapsing across Europe in the later medieval period, instability itself seems to have become almost institutionalized, professionalized even. Let's look at how the chaos caused by mercenary companies in the 14th century turned destruction into a calculated, almost business-like model.
Yeah, this is where chaos gets disturbingly organized. You have these mercenary companies, the famous Italian condottieri, the French courtiers, the flayers. They basically formalized their extortion rackets. They didn't just randomly loot and pillage anymore. They started systematically collecting appetus.
Appetus, what exactly was that?
It was essentially a forced tribute, protection money, basically. A payment made by a village, a town, sometimes even a whole region, to buy freedom from future attack by that specific mercenary company. Pay us, and we'll leave you alone for now.
They institutionalized the protection racket.
They did. And what's really astonishing is how they professionalized it. They used highly respectable figures, notaries, lawyers, even bankers, to handle their financial affairs, draw up the agreements, manage the payments. They turned military destruction and extortion into an organized, legalistic enterprise. Institutionalized banditry run like a business.
Which makes the mercenaries themselves a kind of formal institutional threat to the actual state, doesn't it? Because they're providing the protection that the local lord or king is supposed to be offering.
Exactly. It highlights the failure of the existing powers. We see this really clearly in Burgundy back in 1364, when this notorious mercenary captain, the archpriest Arnaud de Serval, basically occupied the region with his company.
Right. Arnaud de Serval, technically just a bandit leader.
Technically, yes. Yet the young Duke Philip of Burgundy treated him with immense respect. He even called him his companion, apparently. And Duke Philip ended up paying Arnaud 4,500 gold francs just to buy his departure, to get him to leave peacefully.
Okay, but here's the kicker, right? How did Philip fund that payment?
Ah, yes. That's the key political failure. He funded it by imposing a special tax on his own subjects.
So the very people who had likely already been suffering under the mercenary occupation, maybe even paid appetus themselves.
Yeah.
They were then taxed again by their own lord, specifically to pay off the mercenary captain to leave.
Precisely. You can imagine the bitterness that would cause. It's directing resentment straight at the ruling class.
Yeah. The feudal system is visibly failing its most basic function, guaranteeing security for its people.
And the cycle of instability just becomes self-perpetuating, driven by the economic necessity of the mercenaries and the political cowardice or weakness of the established rulers.
Okay, let's jump forward several centuries now to the 19th century. We see similar dynamics of economic pressure fueling class conflict, but now in an industrial context. And we see the narrative around dissent being actively manipulated by powerful industrial structures, particularly in U.S. labor conflicts.
Yeah, in the U.S. industrial sphere, especially in places like mining and railroads, employers actively used internal divisions within the workforce to break nascent labor organizations. It was a deliberate strategy.
How did they do that?
For instance, they would specifically import Recent immigrants, say, bringing Italians into the Pennsylvania coal districts where the workforce was predominantly Irish or Welsh, specifically to act as strikebreakers during labor disputes.
Undercutting wages and solidarity.
Exactly. This deliberate tactic inevitably fueled immense violence, suspicion, and created really bitter, lasting feelings between different ethnic labor groups, which obviously benefited the employers. Divide and conquer.
And the power structures, the mine owners, the railroad barons, they were also highly effective at framing any organized dissent as illegitimate, as criminal, weren't they? The Molly Maguires are a famous example.
Molly Maguires, yeah. These were Irish miners, mainly in Pennsylvania, who were organizing, often secretly, seeking better wages and safer conditions. They were accused of widespread violence, assassinations, sabotage.
But our sources suggest that might have been, well, a frame-up.
It's certainly arguable. The sources suggest they were arguably framed, or at least the violence attributed to them was exaggerated, precisely because they were becoming highly effective labor organizers. They were intelligent men. Their organizational efforts gave real strength and direction to the miners' resistance against wage cuts and dangerous conditions.
So the system couldn't tolerate effective organization.
It seems not. The response wasn't negotiation or addressing the grievances. It was infiltration by agents like the Pinkertons, followed by highly publicized trials and summary justice. 19 alleged Molly Maguires were eventually executed. It demonstrates how, when powerful economic interests feel threatened, organized resistance is often swiftly reframed as criminal violence to justify crushing it.
And this unwillingness to take real action against systemic injustice, even when people recognize it, echoes in the political sphere too. Thinking about Frederick Douglass and his criticism regarding the Mexican-American War.
Ah, yes, Douglass. He was incredibly scornful of many abolitionists who opposed the war on moral grounds. He saw it, rightly, as a war to expand slavery.
But his criticism was that they didn't back up their words with action.
Exactly. He highlighted the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Despite calling the war disgraceful, cruel, and iniquitous, most opponents, including many abolitionists, just kept paying their taxes. They weren't willing to take genuine, concrete financial action against the government prosecuting war. Douglass argued they were prioritizing their political popularity, their standing within their parties, their desire not to rock the boat too much, over their stated moral principles. He saw it as a massive failure of political courage, a refusal to hazard their popularity by openly and actively opposing the war at all risks, including non-payment of taxes or other forms of direct resistance. Actions didn't match words.
Which brings us, finally, to the great, devastating ideological struggles of the 20th century, where these past cycles of violence, class struggle, and state power seem to have been adopted, modified, and amplified into philosophies of destruction on a scale never seen before.
Yeah, it's a grim destination, but essential to understand. Both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, despite their opposing ideologies in some ways, actually share a key intellectual starting point, according to some analyses.
Which is?
They both explicitly rejected the core optimism and rationalism of the Enlightenment. That belief in gradual progress through reason, human rights, individual liberty, they threw that out.
And replaced it with what?
Instead, they adopted a kind of late 19th century Darwinistic modification. A distortion of Darwin, really.
How so?
It was the belief that progress wasn't slow or inevitable through reason. Progress, they argued, only resulted from violent struggle. Relentless violent struggle either between races, as in Nazism, or between classes, as in communism. Conflict wasn't a problem to be solved. It was enshrined as the necessary driving engine of history itself.
Okay, so for the Communist Project, this idea of class struggle, it led to an initial aim that sounded, on the surface, perhaps straightforward. Economic equality.
Yeah, hypothetically straightforward, as one source puts it. Achieve economic equality for all. But the reality, especially under rigid, centralized state control, quickly demonstrated that generating new wealth, expanding the pie for everyone, was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, within their system.
So if you can't easily create new wealth,
the focus immediately shifted. It shifted to destroying the wealth, the power structures, and the people associated with the old system, and forcibly redistributing whatever riches already existed. Destruction and redistribution became the primary mechanisms, rather than generation.
But the project didn't stop at just economics, did it? It went much, much further. It aimed to reshape humanity itself.
That was the ultimate terrifying goal. They aimed, quite explicitly, to restructure the human spirit in the very image of the communist preconceptions. This totalitarian impulse, The idea that a political system must control not just your body, your labor, your property, but your very consciousness, your thoughts, your loyalties. That's what opened the door to systematic, unimaginable brutality.
We see this in the documented horrors of places like Stalin's Katorga camps.
Absolutely. Prisoners subjected to horrifying 12-hour work shifts, often in unventilated, practically lightless huts, mining radioactive materials with bare hands. All justified by this abstract ideological goal of creating some shining new future built on the rubble of the past and the destruction of undesirable human elements. Ideology, completely divorced from human reality and empathy, became the ultimate tool for systematized, state-sponsored violence on a terrifying scale. #Autorestro.
So we have journeyed through quite a sweep of history today, centuries of societal fracture. From the crumbling walls of Constantinople to the sophisticated courts of the Aztecs, the internal contradictions of Rome, and right up to the ideological laboratories of the 20th century. The key findings seem pretty stark, don't they? Political failure, internal division, paralysis. It almost always seems to precede the final military defeat, regardless of how strong things looked on the surface.
And we've seen again and again that cultural complexity, deep history, immense achievement. None of that is necessarily a shield against a superior or maybe just more ruthless external force, especially one that operates outside the established rules of engagement.
Yeah. And that theme of self-interest kept popping up, whether it's medieval republics prioritizing their rivalry over collective defense or Roman soldiers demanding double pay from a new emperor. That internal self-interest consistently undermines collective security. It accelerates systemic failure.
Institutions become rigid, hidebound by tradition like the Byzantines. Or they try to serve masters with fundamentally contradictory demands, like the poor Roman emperor caught between the people and the army. The structural weakness is always there, isn't it? Just waiting to be exploited by circumstance or a determined foe.
And it's striking how often these societies seem to fail to correctly identify the real existential threats they face. They're too distracted by internal squabbles or too committed to outdated traditions and ways of thinking, they misdiagnose the danger.
Which brings us maybe to our final thought for you, the listener, to consider. If these great cycles of history really do show that chaos and collapse might be the more natural state, and that stable civilization is this rare, fragile exception,
Then what are the subtle warning signs we might be missing right now in the incredible complexity and the sheer velocity of our own age?
our sources focused on past forms of power, military, political, religious. But they might suggest that modern systems, particularly things like surveillance capitalism, could be operating through new structures of conquest and warfare, ones that don't look like tanks or armies.
How so? Conquest of what?
Conquest of attention, maybe? Violation of personal boundaries, claiming dominion over people's agency, their data, their decision-making processes. Yet historically, we've mostly prepared ourselves to recognize and defend against threats that come in the familiar shape of state power, geopolitical rivals, or clearly defined military attacks.
So the question is, are we potentially ill-equipped, conceptually, to defend our collective well-being against a new kind of conquest? One that's maybe camouflaged by friendly names like connectivity, personalization, or interoperability.
One that's perhaps cloaked in incredibly complex, expensive, deliberately illegible machine operations, designed specifically to capture and capitalize on our finite attention spans, our psychological triggers. Could that be the structural fragility we're navigating today, disguised by the familiar language of technology and progress?
Something to think about. We've taken the dive, now go forth and apply that knowledge.
Until next time.